More than 5 years after the COVID school closures, we're still feeling the impact. What's the way forward? That's coming up. Stick with us. Welcome to this week's episode of Faith and Culture. I'm Tré Goins-Phillips, and I'm joined today by the Christian Post's Brandon Showalter. Brandon, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
It's good to be here, Tré. I'm doing well.
Well, I'm glad to have you here with us. We're talking about a new documentary which you recently reviewed. It's called 15 Days, The Real Story of America's Pandemic School Closures. And it covers really what happened in 2020, the ways that our schools so quickly shut down and stayed locked down, which we still are reaping the consequences of those decisions. So, Brandon, you had a review where you dove into so many of the details of this issue, something you've been covering now for years yourself as a reporter. But just off the top, I want to get your thoughts on the documentary.
The documentary, 15 Days, is really excellent. Filmmaker Natalya Murakhver did a fantastic job delineating what happened during that chaotic time. And she's based in New York City. And so there's a heavy emphasis on New York City politics and what it was like for parents in that region of the country. But it really does survey the damage that was done to school children because of those extended school closures all over the country. And what was, I think, really remarkable about it, and I would encourage everyone to go watch it for free on X, as you said, is that she interviewed a wide variety of parents of all races and professions, socioeconomic, strata. There's an NPR reporter. There was a Jewish woman. I mean, it's just everybody, and fathers, mothers, kids, black, white. It really was, you got a snapshot of America and how they all suffered in some of the same ways and unique ways. There was, as I wrote this in the review, there was a sort of a uniqueness and a universality of the suffering of that time. Not only was it because it was scary that there was this disease rampaging the world and the media was being deceptive about the origins. We were told it was bats from a wet market or pangolins. And then, people were thinking that it came from a lab. And then, oh, by the way, many months later, that indeed was found to be true. And then as it unfolded, we saw the media send the messages about, oh, well, it's okay to go and protest in the streets with hundreds or thousands of protesters in the aftermath of George Floyd. But that was fine, but you still couldn't go to church and you couldn't send your kids to school. So large groups in the streets was fine. They weren't super spreaders, but going to school, young children, even though they were at very, very low risk of contracting COVID, that was still off limits. And so that caused tremendous cognitive dissonance in the minds of liberal parents, conservative parents, centrist parents, parents all over the spectrum started to say, something's amiss here, and what's being manipulated? How are we being played? And so Natalya Murakhver, the filmmaker, she narrates the story, does an excellent job spelling it all out, showing the impacts on children, the learning loss, the mental health struggles, all of the things, how it ruptured in families, and just all of that. Kids forced to learn in front of screens with burning eyes, and just all of the insanity of that time in a time of confusion. She just really documents it all about what that period was like and how we were all misled and how people of diverse backgrounds came together in spite of it. So it's a heartening story, even as it is a scary, unnerving story.
Yeah, I think, something we were talking about just before we started this conversation was I was going into that documentary anticipating that I would mostly be overcome with a lot of anger. But more than anything, I was just overcome with a great deal of sorrow and sadness that this is something that we as an American society put our children through, all in the name of more money, more progressive policies, And for what? I mean, it caused such extensive and widespread, as I said at the top, damage to children. And as you just mentioned there and laying out your initial thoughts on the documentary. But something that I want to highlight, and I think you did a good job of pointing out in your review of the documentary, is the filmmaker. She is, and she says this in the documentary, she's progressive, or was progressive. She's not even necessarily, she's not religious. She's not a Christian, but she was able to look and see, actually, I was duped. I thought that all of these things were in our best interest. But looking back as time wore on, I began to see this is actually doing significant damage to us. So talk about in the years since, as a reporter, you've covered a lot of these issues over your career, investigating these matters. It's interesting to see such agreement over, yeah, we didn't handle this well. So talk about some of that.
Yes, the filmmaker Natalya said she did indeed feel duped, and I was actually communicating with her recently, and she's that time during her process has sort of affected her thinking ever since. It's one of those things where it really does fundamentally alter the way in which you see the world, and I think a lot of people felt that too, just because of how when you come after your kids and you harm children, I think that taps into something very primal where people start to say, whatever paradigm I'm using, to understand the world, I can't deny what I'm seeing with my own eyes to my own children. And so I have to think of their best interests. And if I see them being harmed and hurt, I'm going to talk to whomever just to at least bounce ideas off of and see if they're seeing what I'm seeing, or at least triaging with other people. I really think, children, when they are harmed, that you have to be just completely hardened to not care about their welfare. And it is unnerving. I think a lot of people really were during the pandemic. I mean, I opened the review by saying that I found some old, correspondence that I had written during that time to some friends, and I was taken aback by how dark and troubled my musings were. And I was like, wow. And it is, I think so many of us have, that's 5 years in the rearview mirror now, and we've just preferred to forget about it because of how disruptive it was. It was such a tremendous lurch. And to everyone who's listening, I would just say, if you were an adult during that time, you need to thank God that you have the ability to do that, because your brain can compartmentalize and at least try to put that out of mind. Children who were forced to endure that don't have the cognitive capacity. Their brains were still developing during that time. They had so many of their opportunities in school, graduation taken from them. There was trauma, and those kinds of things really do shape how you see the world, and they affect your health. And I mean, we know about divorces that happened as a result. I mean, there's just so much happened during that time that misguided and I think cynical, political actors actually used something really terrible for their own self-centered ends. The film does take particular aim, I also say this in the review, at Randy Weingarten of the American Federation of Teachers, who, it's a very compelling case that the teachers' unions were one of the main driving forces, if not the main driving force, behind keeping schools closed well beyond what anyone thought was necessary. To understand that 15 days, 2 weeks to slow the spread, as the phrase went, when the pandemic hit the world. Natalya knew that was something to just hit her gut, that was not going to be the case, and that if you shut the schools down for 2 weeks, it was going to be quite onerous to reopen them. And even when you saw nations like Sweden, which took a completely different approach to what we did here in America, it's a very jarring juxtaposition of what it was like for different nations, depending on where you were. And there was some variety in the United States too. I mean, Florida was quite different than New York, for example. But we can't forget this disruptive time as much as we would like to, because I think, those who are those who forget their history are doomed to repeat it. And that's not a cliche. It's really true.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, often the cliches that we say are cliches because they're true, right? It's something that's
Good
like,
at it.
well,
Right.
it's endured time, and that's something that I want to talk to you about on the other side of the break. But everybody, stick with us. We'll be right back with more Faith and Culture and Brandon Showalter. Welcome back to Faith and Culture. I'm joined by Brandon Showalter. And Brandon, we were just talking about how short our memories are, and we just saw New York City elect a Democratic socialist as its mayor. So talk about how we can, collectively say, yeah, that was handled poorly, and then just 5 years and some months later, elect somebody who, by all conventional wisdom, would endorse the exact same policies that we all universally agreed were problematic.
It's wild, man. I have to say, I think if there was to be another COVID pandemic again now, the memory isn't so lost that even if the new mayor of New York would try to do something like that, I think there would be much more of a revolt, because I don't think anybody is expecting another pandemic of the same kind. And I think that even though many of us have tried to block out those memories, those traumas, those disruptions, that there would be, I don't think people would tolerate masking kids. I mean, the film doesn't really touch on masking, but the school closures, I don't think people would not tolerate. I do think that there's enough fight left in people that even if you elect someone who is progressive and would be like-minded and of the same mind of 2020, I still think that there was enough skepticism across the spectrum that people would demand something different, even if they tried to impose similar conditions on the populace. But we'll see. I mean, there are I think there is a kind of, I think part of the issue, just my opinion, is that people think in sound bites and clips, and we don't have in addition to wanting to block out that terrible time, people don't have a linear view of long-term history anymore. It's just kind of, our attention spans are so short and social media driven that I think there's a forgetfulness that has taken root. And so I don't know. I mean, we'll see what happens. I kind of wonder what other issues might happen in New York that cause, disruptions of another kind, because it does seem to be, quite a pivot point in American politics when someone like Mamdani is elected. And in whatever you think of him, there's who can deny the significance of that. And so we'll have to just wait and see. But I think that I would just reiterate that I think that there's a forgetfulness of what the COVID time was like. And I think people think that, we've just moved on from that. Well, maybe we have in some ways, but maybe we haven't. And we would do well to think long-term and also be forward-thinking too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you write in your review of the documentary that the film argues closures were, quote, these are your words, were, quote, carried out in service to leftist political goals and equity. So can you unpack some of what you mean there, and how the film does highlight that, as I said just several minutes ago in our first segment, that kids really were in so many ways held hostage in exchange for not just money, but the embrace of very progressive ideologies?
Well, I would go back to that. And when people watch the film, when they hear about the left-wing political actors saying what they did about their goals and equity, again, I would say AFT President Randy Weingarten and others, Becky Pringle, there were others who would speak of those themes. And it all seemed to be about, we need to get where we need to get. In the lead up to the 2020 election, which, as everyone remembers, was bitterly contested. And so those themes, you see sound bites. Natalya, the filmmaker, does a great job sort of showing how people started getting the idea that this was political, because people were saying as much, that we need to keep the schools closed because we have all of these things that we need to come in light of everything that's sort of stirring. And there would be, sprinkled in with concerns about kids' health. And yes, we do want to open the schools, but it kept being extended and extended and extended. And it just wore out the patience of a lot of parents and public who were just so frustrated. And you saw them coming together at school boards saying something's not right here, because the political goals were spoken of in the media. And it can be very dizzying depending on which media you watch and read. But I think that it's that was a very perceptive, the way she documented it was a very astute, perceptive analysis that, no, there's more than what meets the eye here. It's more than just genuine concern about young kids contracting a respiratory virus, and even though they were very low risk of doing so,
right?
And there was more to it, and there's evidence, compelling evidence, showing that there were other goals in consideration that were not about child welfare. And that's a disgrace, I think. I don't think a politician, whether they are right wing or left wing, who does that deserves to be in a position of influence. I mean, really, our children have to come first, and politicians and policy people with goals of their own. It's compellingly presented in the documentary that was indeed what was happening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was even chilling, and so many of the quotes were chilling, but I think one that sticks out in my mind as one of the most chilling clips that the filmmaker put in the documentary was Jane Fonda, right? When she was saying the actor Jane Fonda saying, "This was God's gift to the left, COVID. This is our chance to shove down whatever climate or sexual policies that we want to thrust upon not just the American electorate, but children."
What a thing to say. I mean, why would you ever call a pandemic God's gift?
Yeah.
I mean, just think about that. Like, okay, I think it's someone says, is it Rahm Emanuel who says, never let a crisis go to waste? I mean, that's just what, who thinks like that? Only a sociopath. Yeah. I mean, a lot of politicians do it, but it's a very ugly and nefarious thing, I think, to take something that's tragic and then exploit it for your own gain. I mean, I say that just knowing that, again, there's corruption in all political parties, and there are people who are dirty and do those things. But to use a global pandemic where the whole world was convulsing and then treat it as though it's something that God did for you. And, I think God, as a Christian, as a person of faith, I can see that there were, he works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. That's Romans 8:28. That's a scripture verse that a lot of us sort of bank on when we don't know what to understand about the world and how crazy life can be going. But there was family togetherness that happened as a result of this disruption. There were people that recalibrated in healthy ways as a result of the pandemic. And so it's not as though no good came out of it. But I think, to treat this as something that God gave you so that your political goals could be met, it's pretty disturbing.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to pause here. Everybody stick with us. We'll be right back with more Faith and Culture in just 1 minute. Welcome back to Faith and Culture. We're here with Brandon Showalter. And Brandon, as a Bible-believing Christian, as a reporter who covers these things, of course, as a believer, what ultimately gives you hope and sustains you?
Well, I was saying earlier about the cliche of the cliches being true, the old adage about not forgetting history, you're doomed to repeat it. It sounds so maybe religiously simplistic, but I genuinely believe as a Christian that God is on the throne and that he's good. I do believe in God's sovereign providence over history. And it's that he sees and knows. The Lord, nothing escapes his gaze. He sees every injustice. He sees everything that was done during the pandemic by people with nefarious motives. And he sees the actions of those who love him and who were doing their best. And, Jesus was acquainted with our griefs, and his property is always have mercy. And so I will stake my life on the goodness of God, despite all of the chaos of our time, including the chaos of 2020. And I genuinely believe that if people put their faith and hope and trust in Jesus Christ the Lord, they too can be saved. They can be established in right relationship to God, and they can know the living God and walk in his ways and be restored to life. That's the hope of the gospel. I believe that more deeply now than ever. And especially when you come face to face with heavy stuff like we've been discussing, whether it was the pandemic school closures or the gender ideology or everything else that represents the chaos of our era, Jesus is the capital A antidote. I believe he sets captives free. He's still healing. He's still delivering. He still can be trusted. And, I just think in these times we need to be discerning and crack open our Bibles every day, stay tender to the Lord's heart, and just do our very best. And it counts. And God knows. And that's kind of how the approach I have to take as a reporter anyway, because it can be very easy. I've, struggled myself seeing all of the wickedness, seeing the evil, wondering, it's so overwhelming. It's so vast. You realize how many structures have it embedded in their systems. And how do you even tell the truth when it's just this mammoth behemoth of iniquity? And you just have to remember, okay, with God, nothing's impossible. It seems like it's overwhelming, and yet do we really believe that God is bigger and better and more powerful than even the most systematically depraved thing that you can see, even when it's surrounding you? God is still good, and he's still on the throne. And it's just comforting to believe that. I do believe that because the Bible says so, but I just deep down in my soul, if I didn't believe that God is good and powerful, I think I would collapse. And many people did during the pandemic. The hope of the gospel really does infuse us with life. And so that's where I am. That's where I was, and that's where I am.
Absolutely. Well, Brandon Showalter, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tré. Good to be with you.
That is all the time we have for this week's episode of Faith and Culture. Thank you so much for being here. If you want more news from a Christian perspective, as always, head on over to cbnnews.com and also check out the Faith and Culture podcast. We have extended conversations on this and so much more. Thank you for being here, and God bless you.